Um, so, um, so let me begin. What constituencies or communities are assembled under the sign of the Kristeva Circle, and how do these communities constitute themselves? In what follows, I want to think about the configuration of communities and individuals, their solidity and permanence, or their fragility and impermanence, the stability or instability of the borders that define them, the contingency or necessity of borders that situate individuals in relation to communities, the possibilities of challenging and reconfiguring those borders, and the possibilities of such challenges opening up transformative moments for subjects, communities, and foundational discourses. To respond to Julia Kristeva's work in this company for me at this moment is to read her work alongside others for whom I share equal respect. To do justice to Kristeva's work is to read her work in ways that I have learned in part from reading her alongside with and against a diverse body of work. While the corpus of work alongside which I read Kristeva may not always be the one that she shares and might entail that I read her against herself in some ways, Kristeva remains one of the thinkers from whom I have learned to put together texts which might not seem initially to belong together and to make something new of them. I want then to respond to two conflicting impulses generated by the work of Kristeva. On the one hand, I found her work to be enormously fertile, rich, and thought-provoking. The sheer scope and proliferation of her work is awe-inspiring and elicits my continuing admiration and genuine respect, not least due to Kristeva's dexterity in weaving into her work diverse influences from linguistics, literature, psychoanalysis, art, and philosophy. On the other hand, certain political aspects of her work inspire me a good deal of unease, discomfort, and disenchantment, and in some instances, strong disagreement. Specifically, I reflect here on two different inscriptions of vulnerability in Kristeva's work. One in which an explicit appeal is made to castration anxiety, and one in which I suggest it might be productive to read in terms of castration anxiety, although this appeal is not made in Kristeva's own inscription of it. So in doing so, I reflect on the ways in which the very terms we adopt, the language we use, the metaphors and images we invoke in distributing agency, in allocating vulnerability and blame, trades in the patrolling and policing of borders. The assumptions informing the imagery we employ help to constitute how we construe the relation between individuals and collectivities, subjects and their contextual histories, in ways that can either stabilize and enshrine as permanent the mythologies in which these collectivities participate, or destabilize, disrupt, and challenge, help to rework such mythical investments. Kristeva's corpus has, of course, complicated and in some ways facilitated the thinking of how boundaries function, how permeable and impermeable they are, how pure or impure the regions they ostensibly separate might be, how rigorously and thoroughly and systematically these regions might be contaminated or permeated by their supposed antitheses. Kristeva has done more than most to shed light on the ways in which metaphor and metonymy play into and traverse signification. Her investigation into semiotic cora of effective investment in an economy of drive describes a process of sensible and corporeal conditioning that helps to shape objects and subjects, and as such feeds into and constitutes subjectivities and communities. Indeed, I do not think it would be out of place to suggest that it is Kristeva's revision of Lacan's psychoanalytic understanding of meaning that facilitates precisely the terms of analysis theorists such as Falguni Scherth and Sarah Ahmed employ in their considerations of the dynamics of race and nationalism, on which I will draw in what follows. In understanding meaning not purely as an effect of the symbolic, but as a result of the intertwining of the symbolic and the semiotic, Kristeva moves beyond construing meaning merely as a symbolic function of the law enjoined by prohibition, as is well known. Rather than assume, along with classic phenomenology, a transcendental ego as the origin of meaning, Kristeva's emphasis on the material affective semiotic conditioning of signification, which builds on Freud's understanding of condensation and displacement in dream work, provides a conception of subjects that are continually undergoing production. The propositional, syntactic, referential, symbolic meanings that subjects produce and, crucially, that also produce subjects, therefore, are beset with fluctuating investments in sites of pleasure and displeasure, regulated by a maternal archaic ordering and orchestrated by functions such as expulsion, rejection, and projection. Such investments do not so much precede the referential meaning that Saussurean analysis conceives in terms of signifier and signified, as both enable them and create sites of resistance, revolutions of meaning, and displacements within the free play of signifiers. The question is not so much how discrete subjects produce discrete meanings, but rather how subjects situate themselves in and are made possible by the wider networks of investment and meaningful contexts they inhabit, contexts that facilitate and exceed them in ways that are not entirely circumscribed by any rational account. As Stacey Kaltner puts it, semiotic conditions produce and yet remain foreign to meaning and the subject. Subjects can and do intervene in systems of meaning in order to influence what can count as meaningful, disrupting and redirecting habitual paths of meaning, even as they are acculturated in and by semiotic textures, flows, tonalities, rhythms, and so on, which play into and condition the meanings they produce, meanings which in turn condition the semiotic. I want then to resituate some of Kristeva's more recent interventions by drawing upon work that has been facilitated to some extent by her own earlier analyses. My argument draws upon Fanon, Iannolo, Sheth, Ahmed, and others, some of which is informed by Kristeva's own work, particularly around language and the questioning of boundaries, the identification of objects as distinct from subjects, and abjection. And in this regard, I draw in particular on Ahmed's reflections on the work that metaphorical language accomplishes in terms of notions such as closure and containment, porosity and the permeability of borders, the skin of the community, as she calls it, and how communities strive to keep out certain members of their polities while keeping others in their place, or move them out of their places, resituating them, imposing on them in the process some preconceived ideal as to how they should live their lives. Let me turn then to the first inscription of vulnerability in Kristeva's work, to which I attend. In her call for empathy for the disabled, Kristeva argues that we should incorporate vulnerability into the Enlightenment humanism that has traditionally consisted of liberty, equality, and fraternity. She appeals to the anxiety or fear of castration in two different registers. First, in relation to typical responses to disability, and second, in relation to the transformative project in which she sees her own work as a psychoanalyst engaged. She suggests that, quote, those not afflicted with these incapacities are faced with the anxiety of castration, the horror of narcissistic injury, thus deepening the most untreatable of exclusions. And we already heard about this in Josh's paper earlier in the conference. She understands psychoanalysis as the discourse best able to recognize the lack of being, that is, she says, inscribed in the vulnerability of the speaking being, and thus sees psychoanalysis as key to the project in which, as she says, my fear of castration, narcissistic injury, defect, and death repressed until now, is transformed into attention, patience, and solidarity capable of refining my being in the world, end quote. At the same time, Kristeva is careful to sorry, I forgot to put the thing on, so I just lost my place. At the same time, Kristeva is careful not to conflate with disability the lack of being that castration inscribes in every being. Quote, if every speaking being is constructed around a central deficiency, disability inflicts a very different trial. The disabled subject is confronted with the irremediable lacks or insufficiencies that evolve within certain limits when they don't stagnate or worsen. In the course of her argument, Kristeva singles out disability, emphasizing the specificity of those who suffer from disability, the incomparable singularity of this exclusion that is not like any others, as she says. Citing the progress in attaining rights made by those rejected because of race, social origins, or religious difference, Kristeva suggests that it now seems obvious, this is a quote to us, to resist racism as well as religious persecution or disparagement based on class, whereas she continues, the same does not go for the exclusion from which people with disabilities suffer. Whether or not or how far this apparently obvious resistance to racism is consistently exhibited by Kristeva's own work remains unclear to me, as I will develop further. For the moment, though, bearing in mind Kristeva's appeal to castration, thought as vulnerability, I want to step back from Kristeva's analysis of disability in order to establish how it sits in the context of prevailing approaches to disability and with regard to contemporary discourses around the notion of vulnerability. And obviously I'll have to do this very briefly. Of late, disability theorists have turned to Foucault, whose work on biopolitics can shed light on both the institutionalization of disability oppression in the world and its location in bodies. They are thereby able to bring the body back in, as Eli Clare has argued for, but not at the expense of exploring the institutionalization of ableism, as those to whom Clare responds do in locating oppression in society. At the same time, such theorists are able to draw upon Foucault's insights concerning normalization. A good example of the kind of work being done in this area is the collection of essays Foucault and the Government of Disability, edited by Shirley Tremaine, with a foreword by Liddell McWhirter, a foreword which is representative of Dell's brilliantly apposite, erudite and wry approach. The book, in McWhirter's words, is an effort to, quote, understand and respond to society's policies, laws, institutions, discourses that concern themselves with those who have been marked out as retarded, mentally ill, impaired, defective, and so on. This collection of institutions, discourses, and so on forms the site, I should say multiple sites, for exercises of power that result in distribution of resources, that produce and maintain the ways we think about human normality and abnormality, end quote. In case there is any doubt about the salience of exploring the myriad ways in which the categories of normality and abnormality have played into conceptions of disability, consider the insistent appeal that is made to these categories by the following 1983 United Nations definition of impairment, disability, and handicap, quote, impairment is any loss of or abnormality of psychological, physiological, or anatomical structure of function. Disability is any restriction or lack resulting from an impairment of ability to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal, my emphasis, normal, for a human being. Handicap, a disadvantage for a given individual resulting from an impairment or disability that limits or prevents fulfillment of a rule that is normal depending on age, sex, social, and cultural factors for that individual. That's the end of the definition. So among the reasons we should all, disabled or not, care about the extent to which the so-called abnormality of disability is established in relation to the normality that is supposed to prevail otherwise, is that, as McWhirter reminds us, quote, the various labels used to mark out individuals as abnormal or handicapped are ones that not only could be applied to you tomorrow, maybe following a cardiovascular accident or a train wreck. In fact, one or more of them almost certainly will be applied to you at some point in your life if you live very long, end quote. In short, as McWhirter says, bringing us back to the central insight informing Kristeva's analysis, human beings are vulnerable. Kristeva invokes a patient and attentive listening to vulnerability, as we've heard, combined with a recognition of basic rights, and as Amy, in her paper, talked about that earlier in the conference. It might seem hard to dispute Kristeva's fundamental insight that key to understanding disability is the vulnerability we all in some sense share, yet the question remains how to think vulnerability, a concept that is in need of interrogation in the light of, for example, Jasper Poir's work around concepts of debility and prognosis time. Work that insists on both the querying of disability studies and the problematizing of any appeal to the able-bodiedness as if it were transparent and universal. Such an approach requires the thinking through of transnational and geopolitical perspectives on what might constitute the norm in specific contexts. If, on the one hand, disability is inevitable, its singularity is put into question, yet at the same time, Poir reminds us that lifespan expectancies vary significantly within and across populations, and that there is therefore no fixed life expectancy, so that even the idea that we will inevitably encounter illness, disability in old age needs rethinking. Indeed, the very idea of what old age might mean needs to be thought in contextually specific terms. Citing Michael Ralph, Poir appeals to his, quote, argument about an artistic creativity that surplus time engenders in hip-hop artists, that is, time freed up by virtue of a prognosis that says you don't have much time to live, a euphoric release of freedom occasioned by the sense that you have exceeded the dismal prognosis that you will die at an early age. End quote. Ralph and Poir thereby remind us that lived time has built into it dramatically different expectations about how long we might reasonably expect to live based on the socioeconomic, racialized, and national context in which we live. To account for those contexts is to think through what it means to be able-bodied in ways that are contingent upon specific expectations and norms that refuse a generalized appeal to able-bodiedness, the generality of which will register only by replaying stereotypical default identity positions in ways that conflate them with universality and preclude access to their specific normativity. This suggests the need to inhabit the tension that requires us, on the one hand, not to insist upon the singularity and specificity of disability to the extent of conceptualizing a sharp dividing line between the disabled and the able-bodied, since we should construe able-bodiedness as a temporary condition that will inevitably give way to what Rosemary Garland Thomas calls bodily vulnerability to the randomness of fate. On the other hand, the very notion of inevitability needs to be calibrated in ways that take account of salient differences in culturally specific and geopolitical factors that help to constitute life expectancy and which, as such, render fate less random. Whatever problems one might discern in Kristeva's discourse on disability and vulnerability, it seems to me that Kristeva makes an effort to preserve the agency of those society labels as disabled, even if that effort is invisibly adumbrated according to routine default assumptions. But how does this sit when it comes to another issue, namely the question of the veil, where an implicit appeal is also made to vulnerability, yet there is no corresponding appeal to accord rights to those wishing to wear the veil, a lacuna that I, along with many others, find highly problematic. Before I turn to this latter question, let me take a moment to note that in a recent paper by Sarah Hansen, published in the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, she argues, I think rightly, that despite the tensions between Kristeva's approach and biopolitics, there are also some important parallels between Kristevan melancholic bodies and biopolitical bodies. In contextualizing biopolitics with reference to Achille Mbembe's analysis of necropolitics, I would add that the very world we live in, the materiality of our enjoyment, the threshold of what it takes to survive, is conditioned by a series of representations that are naturalized by the cultures in which we are steeped. And in this sense, we live not just from things, but also from our representations of them, what it means to enjoy, its affectivity, and what it takes to survive, how the basic necessities of life are articulated, and therefore what something like bare life means are delineated culturally, that is, conditioned by representations of the precise ways in which a life or lives signify as significant or fail to do so. Mbembe supplements Foucault's and Agamben's discussions of the biopolitical and the state of exception by moving their centre of gravity away from the camps as the nomos of modernity and toward considerations that include Israel's colonization of Palestine, plantation economies, and war machines. And in doing so, the focus of attention is on the ways in which biopolitics is woven into necropolitics, and thereby we're able to explore a zone of indistinction that Agamben leaves unexplored to some extent. The incessant, ongoing, relentless naturalization of our self-representations requires us to constantly renew our efforts to wrench ourselves free of the terms into which our very bodily desires so readily settle, so that we are able to recognize normativity as normative and to put it into play, to be able to recognize our assumptions as assumptions and to reformulate our natural interpretations of the world as questions is what is at stake in McWhorter's observation that, quote, the power knowledge networks that produce and regulate disability also produce ability, ableness, normality. Normality has a history, a set of investments, an entire array of supports and assumptions that bring it into being, sustain it and alter it when conditions so demand. To look at our world as it is seen by disability activists and scholars, to analyze and interpret and lament and decry and appraise from perspectives such as these, is to look at the world we all live in, minus some of the assumptions many of us might usually make, and plus some of the questions we might not think to ask, and that is to open ourselves to the possibility of imagining something new. To try to become vigilant, then, about seeing how easily and consistently and permanently entrenched we so often are in the seductions of normality is part of the trick, where normality is problematized not just in terms of able-bodiedness, but also in the light of socio-economic and transnational factors affecting life expectancy. And this is a project for which Kristeva's insights can be and have been mobilized. How then might we think Kristeva's appeal to vulnerability in relation to disability, together with what I suggest, might be productively read as a performance of castration anxiety with regard to those who practice veiling? How might these two moments in her thought shed light on one another, and how might they be thought in relation to the question of recognizing basic rights? Before considering further Kristeva's position on this latter issue, I want again to step back briefly to provide some context to this question. Thanks to race and post-colonial theorists, we've become familiar with certain tropes that frequently arose as part of the colonial effort to bring native peoples into line. Such gestures were performed in the name of ostensibly universal humanist cosmopolitan values, in the name of civilizing the natives, allegedly for the sake of rationality. What this turned out to mean was an incessant recapitulation of the essential irrationality of those who were to be subjugated. Scheth takes up this argument and gives it a new twist. According to the demand that everyone be like us within reason, whatever does not appear to fit in with Western norms, she suggests, is considered offensive, strange, and transgressive. Hence, the veil becomes a sign of cultural strangeness that cannot be tolerated by nations that take themselves to be characterized by an open, democratic, and transparent society. The so-called choice of Muslim women to cover themselves up is seen in and of itself as defiant of Western values, as unreasonable and unruly, as Sheth puts it. In elaborating this point, Sheth remarks upon the tendency of the Western world to make the veil stand in for the worst non-representative but most notorious practices of all Muslim culture, ranging from polygamy to sexual slavery to terrorism to suicide bombings, the systematic oppression of women, political repression, female genital mutilation, and perhaps worst of all, the stark refusal to accept certain quintessential principles of Western liberalism. The logic at work here is that not only is the veil taken as a synecdoche for the whole of Islam, becoming embroiled in a metonymic slippage from veiling to terrorism, but also that, in Sheth's words, the veil itself becomes the naturalized target of the state's hostility. Sheth continues, Islam is perceived as a culture whose principles and visual significations are fundamentally transgressive to Western liberal norms. As such, Islam and Muslims imply a radical heterogeneity and cultural ontology so distinct from the prevailing political culture that it and they are naturalized under the banner of irrationality, unreason, or madness. The generic demand that people discard customs that make them stand out from Western norms is stipulated further by Sheth in terms of Western liberal feminist assumptions that the West is simply better than non-Western cultures, an idea that is perpetuated by a highly selective and idealized interpretation of Western culture as free and autonomous. From these assumptions proceed the belief that covering up one's body must be a product of patriarchal oppression. To wear a veil can only be construed, in her words, as a response to coercion from a patriarchal authority or in submission to attempts to control one's sexuality, end quote. To assume that there can only be one reason a woman would wear a veil, and to articulate that reason in ways that are continuous with tenets that derive from a particular version of Western feminism, namely liberal feminism, is, argues Sheth, problematic at a number of levels. It ignores the diverse array of specific contexts in which the reasons for which particular women in particular cultures and situations decide to veil, far from capitulating to male control, include precisely the opposite, since some women find that wearing the chadar or the niqab puts them in control of their sexuality by liberating them from prying gazes. To assume that veiling can only be construed as submissive, whether to religious ideology or male power, is to attribute to a highly diverse and multifarious set of women the same lack of agency, thereby participating in the supposition that they couldn't possibly be doing this of their own accord, as Sheth puts it, and that they must be subject to external constraints or pressures. To deny women agency in this way positions them as powerless and infantile, where in fact, as Fanon and Mahanti point out, veiling has been a resource of resistance for women. The wider point that Sheth makes is that we should understand, this is a quote, understand veiling as part of a set of customs and decisions that are negotiated in relation to one's ever-dynamic circumstances, which, far from simply signalling a blanket capitulation to authority, include negotiating a personal and professional autonomy from elders and family, and invoking a stance of political resistance to a national administration rather than a symbol of religious commitment, end quote. In short, the reasons women decide to veil are as varied as the women themselves who veil. To identify veiling purely and simply as a product of coercion is to refuse to grant women the autonomy that they see themselves as practicing. It is also to endorse the liberal ideals that subjects are fully formed, irrespective of their context, while at the same time it is to imagine, as Sheth says, the context in which one finds oneself are either fully formed or ideal or completely independent from the subject in question. Let me pause to review some of the major points Sheth makes. First, she remarks the illusion of differences between a range of practices that taken to be symbolic of Muslim culture, such that the veil, polygamy, suicide bombings become more or less synonymous with one another in a Western imaginary that reads the wearers of the veil as potential terrorists. The veil inhabits the role of synecdoche. It comes to stand for a series of outrageous and incomprehensible practices to which foreign cultures subject their women. Second, veiling thereby becomes instrumental in signifying the fundamental irrationality or madness of a culture that refuses to be assimilated into the ostensible transparency, autonomy, and freedom that are represented as key values in a Western culture, which, however, is presented only in a highly idealized version. This idealized version, which becomes the pretext for condemning the infiltration of Islamic symbolism into the public realm, presents the separation of state from religion as fundamental to the West, for example, yet it can only maintain this fictive myth of separation by ignoring the extent to which Western calendars, holidays, etc., in fact continue to be organized by a Christian agenda, and as such betray the alleged religious neutrality that is nominally so dear to Western states. Third, in failing to contextualize the practice of veiling, there is a failure to read the actions of Muslim women as autonomous agents in a variety of situations, and a reduction of veiling to a product of coercion, which attributes an essential lack of agency to all Muslim women, as if they were devoid of power, individuality, and specificity. Turning to Kristeva, we find a remarkable synchrony between her observations on the topic of veiling and Chef's analysis of the tendency to reduce veiling to coercion by patriarchy, its consequent imputed lack of agency, its equation with, if not madness, then psychical instability, and its implication in a metonymic slide that elides its differences from violent practices and then becomes representative of the whole of Muslim culture. Kristeva suggests that a young girl is, quote, pushed by her father and brothers to wear the veil, that veiling is practiced by those who suffer from dual personalities or psychical splits, and that, quote, there is not such a wide gulf between Palestinian suicide bombers and our young girls in veils, end quote. In the final analysis, it is difficult not to discern vestiges of French colonialism in such characterizations. If we turn back with Yanolo to Fanon's essay, Algeria Unveiled, in which he, I think I'm a bit out of sync with my slides here. If we turn back to Fanon's essay, Algeria Unveiled, in which he articulates what he takes to be the political doctrine of French colonialism in relation to Algeria, this point can be illuminated precisely along the lines of castration anxiety. Fanon identifies the penetration of the veil as key to colonialist logic, which he characterizes as follows. If we want to destroy the structure of Algerian society, its capacity for resistance, we must first of all conquer the women. We must go and find them behind the veil, where they hide themselves in the houses where the men keep them out of sight, end quote. As Yanolo unpacks this, the impenetrability of the veil that the colonial impulse construes itself as having to break through is also the impenetrability of the Orient as such. The veil then becomes castrating. It prevents penetrability. It stands in the way of the colonial drive, the desire to conquer, to know, to control. As such, it figures the veil as intolerable because it resists that which takes itself for the light of reason. It confronts the colonial master with a screen of darkness beneath which he imagines to reside the true Orient, if only he could rend the veil that hides it. It prohibits his gaze, it resists the will to know, the will to power, it refuses to yield. The encounter with the veil, then, which marks the limits of this mastery, constitutes a traumatic encounter. It blocks the ostensible progress of knowledge that the colonizer would claim. It stands in the way of the ideal of transparency to which the will to dominate appeals. With modernity, says Yanolo, drawing upon Foucault, comes a new form of institutional power which is based on visibility and transparency and which refuses to tolerate areas of darkness. It constitutes an ineradicable, untamable, recalcitrant alterity. It becomes clear that banning the veil is less about any empirical threat posed by the women who choose to wear it than it is about securing the subject of representation in the mythology of transparency and openness that is so dear to Western traditions of so-called democracy. The veil is castrating because it signifies the impenetrability of the Orient. It impedes the will to know. To penetrate its unyielding darkness is to secure the penetrability of women, which, in the all too familiar trope of figuring the mastery of land in terms of female sexuality, in turn becomes symbolic of the conquerability of the mysterious lands of the Orient. Western imaginaries have become invested in the symbolism of the veil as threatening, castrating, as a placeholder for the traumatic real, that which holds in place systems of meaning, but which itself can only be indicated as somehow unimaginable, unrepresentable, the objet pétillard. The logic that is installed here involves then yet another displacement, a projection in which the trauma of colonization for the colonized is denied or disavowed, displaced onto the colonizer, who finds him herself traumatized in the face of the veil. I am not responsible for traumatizing the other is responsible for a trauma that affects me by stopping in its tracks the will to mastery, knowledge, and control. The colonizer thus avoids taking responsibility for invading the land of the colonized for prohibiting native peoples the right to speak the language, the right to orchestrate their lives in the ways they see fit, and to inhabit their lands in the ways to which their cultures have habituated them. Instead of acknowledging invasion, oppression, coercion, it is the colonizer who construes himself as the one who is wounded, affronted, afflicted by the blockage of the gaze that the veil comes to signify. My suggestion then is that such a disavowal structures the reaction of those who align themselves with the French law that prohibited the wearing of the veil in public, and that the supporters of that law partake in a similar displacement or disavowal as when Kristeva suggests, quote, a ban on wearing the veil might be necessary. The question is, for whom is it necessary and for what purpose? Perhaps not so much for the protection of those who wear it as for the protection of those who are confronted with the veil and who are displacing the sort of traumatic wound of colonialism. Even if England has not instituted a similar prohibition, it is certainly the case that plenty of anxiety has been fueled by those who wear the veil, as is indicated by a recent case in which a judge required a defendant to remove her niqab. In the final part of this paper, which I begin by commenting on a billboard that recently appeared in North London, where I'm living at the moment, we will see how the anxiety provoked by the veil is fueled by a fear of alterity, which, according to the effective pool in which this image trades, must be counteracted in the name of preserving national security, sealing our borders which are imagined to have become too permeable, too leaky, too indeterminate. We can thereby illustrate the metonymic displacement or slippage to which Sheth alerts us that occurs between the veil and multiple potential threats that are marked by their association with Islam according to what Ahmed calls stereotypes that are already in place and which facilitate what she calls a slide, for example, between asylum seekers and terrorists. Ahmed draws attention to, as she puts it, the structural possibility that the terrorist could be anyone and anywhere. The narrative of the could-be terrorist, in which the terrorist is the one that hides in the shadows, has a double edge. On the one hand, the figure of the terrorist is detached from particular bodies, this is Ahmed, as a shadowy figure, and unspecifiable may come to pass, and she's quoting Masumi there. But she continues, it is this could-be-ness, this detachment, which also allows the restriction on the mobility of those bodies that are read as associated with terrorism. So in this striking image, which appeared in January of this year on Seven Sisters Road, a major arterial road running through North London, veiling functions as the background against which a threat to those who fail to declare income to the government is constituted. The image, in which, with the exception of the eyes, the face is completely concealed, plays on the symbolic matrix surrounding the niqab, operating according to the metonymic displacement Sheth evokes, as well as to Ahmed's could-be-ness, Yenella's analysis of the traumatic encounter with the veil. The image confronting us reveals a sultry pair of eyes belonging to a vaguely exotic, eroticized female of indeterminate middle-class origin who sees without being seen, who capitalizes on the wealth of England without paying her dues. The text accompanying the image issues the threat, "We are closing in on you," a threat intended to make its targets come clean, to stop hiding in the shadows, to unveil themselves and come into the full light of day, to stand up and be counted along with the upright moral citizens who pay their taxes. The threat that "we are closing in on you" is intended to provoke fear, as is made palpable by the addition, "if you've disclosed all your income, you have nothing to fear," which carries with it the clear implication that if you have failed to disclose all your income, you have everything to fear. The image implicitly targets illegal immigrants, nannies, those who work in the UK, and those who receive money under the table, and anyone else who facilitates such underhand manoeuvres, or who might be themselves evading taxes illegally, and thereby taken to tacitly associate themselves in Ahmed's could-be terrorist sort of move, tacitly associate themselves with such undesirables. Such discourses surrounding immigration are fueled in the UK by the rise of UKIP, a political party that capitalizes on fears and resentment that foreigners are invading our country and taking our jobs. Myths are promulgated that encourage us to envision infinite numbers of marauding asylum seekers who invade our borders and who could be potential terrorists. Do not become like them, this image warns us. Distinguish yourselves, do the right thing, become transparent. If you are evading taxes illegally, if you are a company that is considered not only too big to fail, but also too big to pay taxes, then you have nothing to fear. You have done nothing wrong. You have more than enough money to pay expensive accountants to find the legal loopholes that exist to ensure that the balance of power and wealth stay the same, give or take a few dollars, pounds, euros, or yen. You might think that the Greeks put an end to oligarchy when they founded a partial democracy, but you'd be wrong. Its continuation is insidious. The image and its caption operate at a number of levels, which participate in border control. It patrols the borders according to us and them, the lawful and the unlawful, the successful and the unsuccessful, the significant and the insignificant, a distinction it performs through the condensation of several elements that might be enumerated as follows. Okay, am I way behind? Am I just going? Okay, I'm going the wrong way here. Sorry. Okay. So that might be enumerated as follows. Potential tax invaders, women who hide their earnings, immigrants who might be illegal, those who are outside the system, those who resist capitalism for the rich, those who refuse to be seen, those who are threats to the system, the unruly, the defiant, the transgressive, women who wear veils, women who hide behind veils, women who are probably Muslim, women who might be terrorists, women who could be hiding a bomb. That's probably why they're wearing those veils in the first place. They are hiding within our borders. This criminal element must be discovered, identified, eliminated, incarcerated, ousted from the polity, contained in prisons, despite the fact that prisons become breeding grounds for further criminality. It is the job of the upright, law-abiding, patriotic citizens to seek out this criminal element. They are taking our jobs, taking advantage of the welfare system, our national health service. They will be found, the billboard warns. They will be apprehended. They will be tried and found guilty. There is nowhere to hide. They will be flushed out. We are closing in on you. The threat evokes the need to eliminate parasites on our system, to shore up our borders, to keep those who take advantage of us out. If you fail to obey our laws when you are in our country, we will expel you. We will send you back to where you came from, to that backward country where they make you wear veils, where you can hide all you want, because it is rife with corruption. It is a place of primitive lawlessness, where no one will care if you pay your taxes or not, where the perverse brand of capitalism that the West proselytizes is not yet the only rule. The discourse that informs this image, the effective background in terms of which it trades, appeals to a version of nationalism that requires us to safeguard our borders against unlawful foreign invaders. Nationalism functions here, in Schoen's words, as a site of libidinal investment in what is imagined to be a sphere of transparency illuminated by Enlightenment values, which must secure itself against what is imagined to be the darkness of those who threaten our integrity and must therefore be kept securely outside. Okay, I think I'm going to just talk through the rest of this because I've already gone on a little too long. So just very briefly then, Kristeva comments on this Klaramber's morphology of the draped suit. And here's what she says. She says, let us consider a veiled woman. She is venerated. Is she venerated, protected, as the Charter indicates and claims, or a sacrificed, decapitated, immured woman? Answering her in question, she goes on, I see a casket. I really want to believe there's a woman there, but buried alive. And she then goes on, so she is obviously is kind of negative about that. I mean, she then goes on to comment on Jules Seurat's The Veil, which she says is completely different. And in fact, she says it reminds her of the fluid veils of Corradini, and it's the absolute imaginary head in a class of its own, beauty playing with the boundaries of forgetting. Now, she'd already referred to Corradini a couple of years earlier, and specifically to Corradini's purity. And here you see the veiled statue. And in the context of talking about the veiling of the phallus, she talks about the displacement of veiling onto the entire body. And basically, without going into too much detail, reads this in terms of phallic displacement, suggesting that it's not merely that the veil renders the entire body phallic, but rather that the veil puts into question the entire body of representation itself. Culture is a representation that unfolds representation. And she adds that, so we witness in Corradini a veritable revolution of thought. She reads this as an exquisite gesture that invites us to seek ways to veil or unveil the key values of a culture in crisis and to transmute them. And she also suggests that mystery and revolt are the same thing in the context of such works of art. So the question I want to raise then is really, what is why if she sees in Seurat and Corradini a revolt, then what is it that prevents her reading a revolt when, for example, French Muslim women protest for their right to wear the veil? And I mean, obviously, in some sense, the answer to that question is very obvious in the sense that she's as we've heard in some papers already this afternoon, excuse me, that insofar as she tends to submerge revolt into the sort of singular sites of art and psychoanalysis, she's perhaps less willing to see the political sites of revolt that exist out there. I would say that suggests that we need to maybe push her a little further on what is happening in these kinds of protests. But what I really want to focus on is this sort of this idea of flipping the veil, and what I want to suggest is that, and this kind of brings me to the I'm just going to flip ahead here to the final image I want to show of a woman protesting the banning of the veil, and here's what she says: that the veil covering your eyes is much more dangerous than the veil covering my hair. And what I want to suggest then is that maybe there's a way of flipping the veil, taking this seriously. That the veil covering your eyes is what's dangerous here. Let me just unpack that very briefly. We're familiar with Du Bois's appeal to the veil, and so what I'm suggesting is that we take this notion of the veil that in some sense interrupts Kristeva's attempt or Kristeva's ability to hear the other stories that I think people like Margaret Garner, Toni Morrison, Achille Mbembe, Frederick Douglass, Orlando Patterson, Paul Gilroy, Frantz Fanon, and many others are asking us to attend to these slightly different stories. So the stories that come off the plantations, the stories that come off the colonies. But what I want to, and I can say more about that if people are interested. But what I want to do by way of a final gesture is actually come back to emphasizing that, above all, and let me just go back to a quote by Sherham there. Above all, by way of closing then, the very analysis that theorists such as Scherth and Archimede provide, and which I've drawn on here, is itself facilitated, however indirectly, by precisely the kinds of thinking that Kristeva's work itself has made possible. In the words of Sherham, the revolution of the semiotic does not challenge or change norms for any given reasons or with any given goals in mind, but it's precisely its unwillingness to simply replace one norm instead of another which makes the semiotic into such a powerful concept. So, rather than constituting a limit of Kristeva's thinking, the refusal of the semiotic to assimilate itself to any particular politics constitutes its productivity. It is up to us, in each instance, to trace the conceptual, affective, and political consequences of semiotic incursions into the symbolic and the symbolic ramifications, to which project I have tried to contribute today. So, in conclusion then, we can debate the nuances of Kristeva's approach to disability, and I've sort of tried to indicate some of the ways in which that might be done, but by suggesting that we read her we read her sort of attitude to the veil in terms of the kind of traumatic encounter, this idea that in some sense, the veil interrupts the clarity of Enlightenment narratives. It slices into it, cuts up, it traumatizes the stories we are so used to hearing and retelling, tales that are told from the point of view of the able-bodied European master, the one with whom Hegelian self-consciousness identifies. What I'm saying is that the veil blocks the supremacy of the white European vantage point that has established itself as the center of philosophical theories of the modern state and the Orientalist gaze, insisting on the murkiness of such views. But if the veiled women of Corradini and Seurat puts in question representation itself by performing phallic displacement, perhaps Clérambault and the protester who draws attention to the veil covering the eyes of those who object to veiling draw attention to the need to displace Western assumptions about who has the right to view and represent and what the authority they call on to do so is. So, in other words, what I'm trying to draw attention to are these veiled stories, these other stories, the stories of the colonies and the plantations that Gilroy and so on bring to light. And in these stories, the veil becomes a site of resistance, and what it hides is not weakness or submission to authority, but the dignity that Orlando Patterson insists is at the heart of the slave's consciousness, even or especially in the midst of a master's degradation. Such dignity is supported and allowed to flourish through the art of music, for example, as integral to life. And let me just end with this quote. Gilroy observes, at the extreme patterns of communication defined by the institution of plantation slavery dictate that we recognize the anti-discursive and extra-linguistic ramifications of power at work in shaping communicative acts. Of course, Kristeva wouldn't necessarily see it as anti-linguistic. So the work of Archimede Sheth and Falguni, Archimede Sheth and Kristeva's work on the semiotic, I would say, allows us to elaborate such power at work, not so much outside communication, but as resounding within the fabric of communicative and not so rational discourse, inhabiting metaphorical reiterations and metonymical displacements that dictate the rhythmic orchestration of our very existence, its ebb and flow, to which we accommodate ourselves so easily unless we continue to interrogate its seductions, an ebb and flow that might be thought as chora, as quasi-transcendental, awash with affects, and the compacted socially saturated memory. Thanks.
General question in the discussion of nationalism and colonization. You talked about the veil and these women, and I'm wondering about. I guess I'm wondering what you would have to say about the fact that these are women, that these discourses, both the political and cultural struggles over nationalism and colonialism, are revolving around women and women's bodies.
Yeah.
And the question, I guess, that bringing, and since you did talk about it in castration, the question of sexual difference, or why these, you talked about in general, but if you had something to say about the fact that these struggles are bringing us back to.
In some ways, it's a very old, which is precisely what the Fanon quote draws attention to. In some ways, but I mean, more than that, the idea that, and this is what I was really trying to get to with the notion of taking these two moments of vulnerability. That women's bodies are, and I think in some sense there's a way in which Kristeva's own attitude to this particular question reinscribes this, that women's bodies are read as always already vulnerable, and rather than questioning that, she kind of, in the analysis I was trying to give, in some ways endorses it by, as Sheth's analysis suggests, by failing to accord women agency, by just as kind of assuming that all women wear veils because they're submitting themselves to some kind of patriarchal authority over which they have no control. And of course, while that may indeed be the case in some cases, it's certainly not the case in all cases. And but the problem with that view is that it kind of assumes that the only symbolic authority at work is the fathers and the brothers who she imagines to be the ones who are really behind the decision of any woman in any situation to veil. And so I was trying to shift that by saying, look, first that's highly problematic, because to say that all women who wear veils lack agency because of patriarchal power is problematic on so many different levels, not the least of which is it refuses to give women agency. But more specifically, in terms of the particular analysis I was giving, it refuses to give women, it refuses to accord women the very singularity that her own account would seem to call for, and that she, this is why I spent time juxtaposing it with the discourse of disability, because for all of the problems that you can find with her analysis of disability, at least she, you might want to problematize even that, like what does it mean to talk about the incomparable singularity of disability, which means that that's somehow is constituting the group of disabled people as more marginalized than any other group that's been discriminated against, which I think is a highly questionable claim. But at least there's an attempt to think through what the sort of singularity of that might be, albeit as in some, and at least as Amy's paper earlier pointed out, at least however you might problematize what Kristeva is doing with disability, and I did try to problematize that drawing on Poir's work to some extent. On the other hand, she has been instrumental in introducing legislation, and important legislation, however limited it might be, in the context of France. So, whereas in this case, she's precisely, denying the right to, by treating women en bloc as a group who, can't possibly know their own mind, and that just seems very, very problematic to me. So. So yeah, I don't know, I'm rambling now, but that's my response.
So I have two questions. The first one is more like a joke, because this billboard, I would rather imagine that it's the revenue officer whose piercing gaze has broken through this paper screen, which I'm trying to hide my income. And, so
that's an interesting read, yeah. I hadn't really thought of that, so thanks, yeah.
It's totally the other way. Tina, what would happen if we imagine that there is no longer a colonizing subject interested in forcing people to conform to normality, but on the contrary, it's a subject much more ambitious. It's a subject which craves global domination, and which is much more interested in having people, play in the playground with all this hullabaloo. Do you want veils? Don't you want veils? Maybe some of us want veils, others don't want veils. So we have sort of, because we are so what's the word? We are superfluous. We're too many.
Yeah.
We should be busy with something, because there is no much use in us anyway. There's nothing for us to do much in terms of being useful for something, but at least we should be busy so that we are not in the way.
So what are you suggesting? That let me see if I understand what.
Whatever is, if there is such a subject interested in domination, it's no longer the old colonizing subject. It's a completely different entity, in whose interest it might be precisely that there are some people with veils and there are some people without veils, and that they sort of engage in all these arguments.
So you're kind of talking about some imaginary possible world that we should.
It's imaginary.
I think Quebec in Canada is this world.
Yeah.
I mean, they're imposed. They have new anti-veil rules coming out of the kind of leftist movement of Quebec culture preservation. So it's not a colonial attitude in that it's Quebecois who have themselves felt colonized by the English forces in Canada. So what are they up to?
Yeah.
So sorry.
I don't. No, it's fine. I think. I was just trying to give a reading of the specific. I was just trying to understand how. To me, it's pretty simple. It seems very problematic to, I read Kristeva as a feminist who constructs feminism as, as Lisa Gunter was saying earlier in a very different context. It's my responsibility to think through what what is happening when Kristeva kind of throws her lot in with this law, and so I really wanted to try and think through, because it's been something that's bothering me for a long time. How is she able to do this? And the way I found that, the only kind of plausible reading I could give of it was to say, look, what's going on here? She is reacting to something which is really a way of her disavowing her own implication as someone who takes French Republican and the indivisibility of the nation and all of that stuff that we know only too well, right, seriously. She's refusing to think through the project of colonialism, and the way that so what she's doing is, as I suggested, she's in this kind of in her failure to really. Because really, it just seems astonishing to me that anyone can sort of say that it's the nation's job to tell women what to wear. I mean, that just seems an astonishing thing. It's an astonishing thing, and the fact that can somehow go along with this incredibly rich and provocative body of work is problematic to me. And so I was just trying to give a reading of that and think that through. But yeah.
It may be the same question, I'm not sure. I wanted the way in which you're relating the will to mastery to the complaint about being traumatized by the blocking of the veil, and the billboard, which to me, when I looked at it, I thought, oh, yes, I see. So now that we can't catch you at the border politically, we'll catch you economically. And we're not in the least bit complaining about being traumatized, because we'll find you exactly where you're undeclared. So I didn't have a problem with you saying that we're closing in on you, but it does say we're closing in on undeclared income. So I'm wondering what need really there is of the notion of trauma there at all, because I have the sense that the will to mastery is not having any trouble whatsoever, and doesn't need to complain about being traumatized. Feels quite confident. I think it's the same question.
I think what I was trying to do was just trying to elaborate the metaphorical sort of condensation and metonymic kind of slippage that's going on, where there's that series of illusions, but what's traumatized, what that image to me is calling up on is the all of the associations of what happens when you're confronted with this apparently offensive veil that is being eluded in this image and used and that kind of you have to be like us, you have to look like us, otherwise you can't really join in the nation. And even though that hasn't happened in England, there have been some moments where it nearly happened. And obviously one has to respect the specificities of France and England, but I didn't want to make it all about France, because there's a lot of problems going on in England around this too. But so all I was suggesting is that there's a way in which that trauma constitutes the background of that image that makes that image readable. And so this whole, what Archimede does when she does this analysis of the could-be terrorists, where she says on the one hand it's precisely by divorcing that from the particular person and associating it with, well, it could just be anyone, that this, the whole sort of war on terror hysteria that everyone has been caught up in, that anyone, we have to anyone could be it could be your neighbor, it could be anyone,
So you're saying this history is precisely what makes that readable.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. I'm going to think about that.
but you know, but more specifically, the trauma of that illusion that I was talking about in relation to Magdalena's question, that it's a projection, it's a refusal, it's not my I haven't done anything. I'm innocent. You're the problem. You're affronting me. I'm the one that's wounded. You're not the one that's been wounded. And so there's a whole disavowal of a history.
I hear that kind of being wounded. All I hear is, I'm the master. It's the inland revenue.
But that's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. That the only way I can understand that you know, because what that image is doing is essentially saying, if you don't conform to the law, then you're going to be like these people, and you know you have to kind of be transparent and be. It's like the old sort of Enlightenment claims: be transparent, don't hide, be clear, and so you know. I mean, I think that, and maybe you just don't read the image the same way as me. That's fine.
So I have kind of a practical question. So I apologize for that in advance, maybe. But so I want to try to push the analogy between disability, the stuff that Kristeva was saying about disability, and the work you're doing here with the veil. And the way that Kristeva wants to overcome the oppression of disability, as I understand her, is to encourage interaction with disabled persons, disabled subjects, see them as subjects, share meaning. And I think that's actually pretty convincing if you see who is doing the work for political activism on behalf of the disabled. It's usually a relative or someone who's had close personal interactions. So I'm wondering if there's a special obstacle in the case of the veil, in that we have this sort of imaginary that you've talked about, which keeps us distant from women wearing the veil, such that we don't interact with them. And in addition, there are usually sort of spatial segregations that also keep us from interacting with those women. So, I guess, is there a practical implication to this analogy that you're drawing?
Yeah, I think we have to be a little careful about how we're using the word "we" here. But yeah, I think that is part of the point that there are. Obviously, there are all kinds of questions about who we talk to, who we live with, who we're friends with, that are implicated in this. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was thinking through some of this, the question of visibility and invisibility with respect to state and the example that you gave. And I was thinking of undocumented immigration in the United States, and I was thinking of some of perhaps a difference between the example that you looked at, where there's a call from the law to secure borders and to secure economic stability through this kind of all-penetrating kind of gaze and mastery that somebody else spoke to earlier. But then I was thinking of the movement in the U.S. among some undocumented folks here who are coming out as undocumented.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether as a pattern of resistance or as a kind of rendering oneself vulnerable to that type of exposure, and
Yeah.
whether you had any thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I actually, strangely enough, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in Ghent, and at an Antigone conference, and someone, his name I can't remember right now, but he was at University of Massachusetts, and he showed some images of undocumented workers with wearing T-shirts saying, "I am an undocumented worker," and was making the point that I think very much along the sort of lines of your question, that I like that phrase, that they're coming out as an undocumented worker, and that sort of, that claiming a symbolic space and refusing to be invisible and actually kind of reworking the symbolic in some way, I think is very interesting, and it in some ways could be read as the exact opposite of this kind of conjuring up of images that image trades on. So yeah, that's interesting. Thanks.
I really like your reading of the veiled woman as basically a threatening figure to the West, as a terroristic figure, and it reminded me of a phenomena that's been going on in the pop world. People like Miley Cyrus, and I'm just using Miley Cyrus as a case of that in order to be seen as a liberated young woman, you have to literally display yourself with virtually every orifice out there to be looked into. And from that perspective, women who don't display themselves are a threat. And it's interesting that in advanced Western society, we've come to this point where it's seen as the great feminist act to display all your orifices, and I just think, what is that about? From that perspective, the veiled woman is A, incredibly powerful, and B, terrorizing, but what does it say about our notions of feminine liberation?
Yeah, I suppose I would sort of try and put the emphasis not so much on the women who, in my view, if women want to display all their orifices, as you put it, that's fine with me, But what's not fine with me is when someone tells other women that they should be doing the same thing. That's what's not fine with me. What women do is kind of up to women, as far as I'm concerned, But so I was kind of trying to put. So I take your point, but I would just put the emphasis in a slightly different place. That that in a way was what I was really trying to focus on. Like it's the colonial gaze that is making this a problem. It's not the women who are displaying whatever they want to display. They can do what they want, as far as I'm concerned. But the connection is the exact connection that somehow it's problematic not to want to do that because of the sort of gaze that expects to have the right to view, and that's where this kind of flipping the veil idea comes in. That that's the veil that's the woman who is saying the veil covering your eyes is more dangerous than the one covering my hair is talking about. Yeah.
Tina, thanks a lot for your talk. I was wondering if you had thought at all about the connection between anxiety in the face of a veil and the kind of anxiety that's manifested in building walls, whether it be between the United States and Mexico or between Israel and U.S., the Gaza wall. And I thought about this because I was recently heard Wendy Brown give a talk about, walling as not, and this is sort of maybe in response also to Sarah's question, that walling is not really an expression of great strength. It's actually an expression of weakness, of anxiety, and perhaps being threatened by the veil is also, it's not an expression of complete mastery. It's an expression of anxiety.
Exactly. Yeah. Then that's very interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, but it's really interesting, and I have to think about it. And and it's particularly interesting to me because I've been in some other work that I'm doing on Rancière. I have thought about the wall. Rancière talks about that film by Chanter about the U.S.-Mexico border, which is the conflicting narratives. It's the redistribution of the sensible. It's like and the reason why it's a powerful film for him is because it's precisely because it gives these two. All it does is explore these two different narratives. That's all it does. It doesn't kind of knock you over the head with telling you what to think. It just says, okay, here's how one group see it, and here's how another. And I'm just going to show it. You do what you want with it. And I have thought about that specifically in relation to a film that I'm sure many people here know, which is Rabbit-Proof Fence, where there's also the rabbit-proof fence on the one hand is seen as replete with all kinds of overtones. The fence that stops the rabbits getting to the agricultural land, the rabbits, of course, that the English brought to Australia in the first place, right? And on the other hand, it becomes this pathway for Molly as part of the stolen generation to find her way home, and it becomes a map of the land. And the way that film is, I mean, the cinematography in that film is amazing. And the film opens, for anyone who doesn't know it, the film opens with this shot, which is this kind of this long unbroken shot where you don't know what you're seeing, and so you see these kind of blobs, and slowly the blobs resolve themselves into the bush and the landscape, this aerial landscape. And so there's kind of an evocation of Australian dot painting, and all kinds of things are going on there, perspective and stuff. But the film is remarkable because I sort of connect it with what Rancia talks about in terms of the Ackerman film, the raw materiality of the fence, and it's about the raw materiality of the fence. And Rancia says that the borders, that it's not surprising that it's often borders and territories that are in dispute in some of the most interesting political work and artwork, in the way that he understands artwork. And that film seems a really interesting example. Not that he talks about it, but a really interesting example of the redistribution of the sensible. And your question also makes me think of another a photograph which he does talk about by Sophie Ristelhuber, which is part of the West Gaza series. And I don't know if anyone knows this. It's the photograph. It's included in the Emancipated Spectator, and it's a photograph of what could be seen as an idyllic landscape with olive trees, or it could be seen as there's this small rubble of rocks, and depending on how you read, what your political sensibilities are and how you read the photo, you'll either see the rubble, these stones in a kind of small winding road as a Palestinian roadblock, or you won't. And that ambiguity is kind of built into that. So she doesn't photograph the 12-foot concrete wall, which she could easily have done. She photographs this much more indeterminate kind of image. And so Rancia, that's for him is a great example of, and it's a great example of political art, precisely in the sense because the sense that it draws attention to the conflict of worlds that exists within that image. So I'll have to think more about this in relationship to veiling. I haven't really thought about that, but thanks a lot for the question. That's a great question. I'll have to think more about that. Yeah.
One more question.
I'm trying to deal with a paradox I sort of perceive in this idea of being powerful and being invisible, or being powerful and being silent. Because it seems like that power only occurs when your silence or your invisibility is visible or audible, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do know what you mean.
And I wonder if, because I do hear your confusion at why a person would deny other women this power over their own bodies, or their garb over their bodies. I wonder if it is a concern that once political attention shifts away from veiled women, if they actually wouldn't become visibly invisible but actually invisible, and if that's the concern. Do you think that could be the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, and it's particularly really interesting given I just kind of skipped over this really quickly at the end, but given precisely the way that when Kristeva is talking about these images by Serra and Cardini and so on, she's talking precisely in terms of the veiling, unveiling, the presence, absence of phallic displacement. That's what is sort of fascinating to her about when the veiling of the phallus is displaced onto the entire body, and it becomes this question of representation as such. And that is in some sense what I kind of like the way you put it. That is in some sense what I was trying to do by saying, look, what's happening is there's this. It's not the move of representation as such. It's the move of who controls representation and who is allowed to be represented, who is allowed to be seen. You could say, yeah. In some ways, it would be much easier if they just would all go away and go back to their own countries, and we in the West don't have to deal with it. That's kind of the logic, huh?
And become actually invisible, not visible.
Yeah. So that's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah. Or I mean, either that, or they look like us, and then it's fine.